Okay, you guys know how this goes. It's another Thursday, another chance to open up the Famitsu sales charts and see Mario Kart just knocking everything out of that. What? What's this? Oh. Well, I'm sure it's in second place. Oh. Hey, it still made top 3. Ooh. I guess, fourth place isn't that bad for a game bundled with a recently released console that's in very high demand. Maybe this means that people are buying the Switch 2 version that's not bundled, because if that's not the case, that would mean that the Switch 2 didn't bounce back after its little post-holiday lull from last week. Let's check the rank. Oh. Yikes. Okay, first thing, just like last week, the Switch 2 is outselling the Switch 1 in a 2-to-1 ratio. I'm still waiting for when we get to that moment where the Switch 1 outsells the Switch 2 in a given week because it is the budget console now. Well, actually, it was always the budget console, but Nintendo decided to shift gears with the Switch 2, so now we have to differentiate between what is the Pro and what is the budget. I believe this is one of the smallest week-over-week shifts that we've seen for the Switch 2. Over the course of the past few weeks, we've seen it go from roughly 65K to roughly 105K, back down to roughly 75K, and then down to 35K, and then now just kind of leveled off at 40K, which is next to the 35K. It'll be interesting to see if this is where the Switch 2 ends up holding for a while. It might shoot back up, it might drop back down, it's anybody's guess. But what I do know for sure is how the discussion will be this week, that the baseline of 35 to 40K is still a very good result, because that's the same thing they said at the 120K mark, the 100K mark, the 60 to 70K mark, and the 35 to 40K mark now, I'm guessing. We will revisit this conversation in a few weeks when that baseline might be around 20K. Another fun thing to acknowledge is that Kirby and the Forgotten Land Star-Crossed World actually had a pretty good start. It just goes to show that if you actually put a lot of effort into your port, people will buy it. Because this game did better than the first week when the Zelda titles came out. So clearly, Nintendo fans will buy the games that have love and effort put into them, because Star-Crossed World carried Kirby to heights that has not been seen by Switch 2 edition. Nah, Mario Party Jamboree did better on its first week, guys. I'm just messing around here. Yeah, this is a console for Mario. It doesn't matter how much better you think the Switch 2 edition of Kirby is over Mario Party, and Mario Party is the most embarrassing Switch 2 edition version out there, but still it got close to 20K on its first week. Yeah, people just buy for the name even if it's low quality, but I think the sales numbers of the Switch 2 also kind of highlight that. Now, Donkey Kong Bonanza managed to retain its spot in the top 10, sitting all the way down at number 8. Selling 10,000 copies, bringing its total up to 286,000, meaning it is at a roughly 15% attachment rate in Japan, which should but end the discussion that Bonanza is the flagship game that's going to be carrying the Switch 2 to new heights, similar to Odyssey and Breath of the Wild for the Switch 1. Now, I think what's particularly interesting about this top 10 list over here is the fact that Metal Gear Solid managed to sell over 60,000 copies on the PS5, which only has 7 million units out there. And the reason that's impressive is because usually Sony games do not make this top 10 list. And that's primarily because, especially in Japan, physical games are not all that popular outside of the Nintendo consoles. And really the only reason they're as popular as they are with the Nintendo consoles is because people don't like paying for additional storage on their consoles, so they have to rely a lot more on cartridge-based games that hold all of the memory. Otherwise, their console fills up with too much data immediately, and that's a big part of the reason why the whole game key card discussion that's been happening in Japan is more about the memory of the Switch 2 and less about the actual ownership DRM stuff. In the West, we care a lot more about having the games on the data of the cartridge because we're all about like that ownership. In Japan, they're a lot more concerned with their consoles running out of space. So seeing a PlayStation 5 game make this top 10 list already is very impressive, but to see it make such a high mark, that's even more impressive. But then again, if this game had come out a few weeks ago or even a month ago, it never would have been in first place because Mario Kart World would have been leading the charge since people were still trying to jump over each other to get a Switch 2 in Japan. Also, I think the Bonanza actually launched better when you're looking at it strictly from physical sales online. But anyway, back to the Switch 2. I expected it to jump back up to roughly 60 or 70K. I thought that was going to be like the line that it draws at since it hit that more often than not in the past few weeks. 40K is a lot more surprising to me, or I guess it's closer to 42K. 42K. That was more surprising for me because I thought it was a one-off. I didn't think that it would go drop down that low. I assumed that a lot of the stock last week was basically run out because of the holidays and then it would just jump back up again. And actually part of the reason I expected a bigger number is because there were more and more shops throughout Japan that were pushing for people to come and buy Switch 2s from them. At least that's what it seemed like while I was digging around. So let me give you guys my complete amateur, non-expert, non-analyst assumptions. And that non-expert assumption should have an even larger asterisk on it because we're talking about Japan, and I know nothing about Japan aside from these 2 random forums that I've been scrolling through over the past few weeks and some auto-dubbed YouTube videos that have been making it up on my timeline. But from what I'm gathering, it seems like over here in the West, we have a scalper issue, and over there in Japan, the issue is the retailers more than the actual scalpers. If anybody here is listening from Japan, I would love for you to correct me on any of this too, because this is just based off of my observation. They have scalpers there too, but it seems like the retailers take more advantage of anything before it gets to the scalpers. And I've kind of touched up a little bit on this earlier, but I'll try to briefly jump through it again. In the West, many of us do not like scalpers, obviously, but many of us love video games. So while we would prefer to just be able to walk into a store to buy something, sometimes in a lot of people's minds, it could just be worth it to pay an extra $50 in order to just save all of that problem and get what you want right now. Now, that $50 is just an arbitrary number that could go up to $500 as we saw with the launch of the PS5, and it can go down to as low as $10 or $20 as we saw with the Switch 2. And if you ever looked up the laws of supply and demand and you've taken into consideration shortages and surpluses and how they relate to price, when the price of something is fluid in that it can actually change, it's very easy to directly gauge the demand, right? The more people are willing to pay for something, the more in demand it is. So while scalping does stink, it's a very clear indicator of how much something is in demand. Because once these things go to the retailers, they usually don't increase in price if they're in high demand. They just sell. And then you have to look at the surpluses and the shortages and make your own conclusions based off of that. The only exception to that rule is that when there is a surplus, the price will eventually drop. We'll see if that's a reality for the Switch 2 or not, but it's just discussing basic economics at this point. But basically, over here in the West, it's very easy to gauge demand when something is out with the scalpers. In the East, specifically in Japan, I'm noticing something a little bit different. So retailers want people to buy their Switch 2s, and because there is obviously at least initial demand for the Nintendo Switch 2 when it first comes out, they find different ways to get people to buy it. Many of the stores in those first few weeks did lotteries. And I think that was explicitly from Nintendo. That was kind of the deal that they had made that Furukawa said they were using to fight off scalpers. Before we even made it to July, those lotteries started to go away. What was left was all of these stores who were only releasing a specific amount of units at the start of like a random day during the week or on the weekend for the most part, but they were requiring something from the individual. Again, earlier on, in early July and late June, they were requiring you to open a store credit card, or you had to have their app downloaded and been an active member for a certain amount of time. All of these requirements set in place. Like imagine I went to Best Buy and Best Buy was like, we can sell you a Switch 2 today, but you're going to have to open a Best Buy credit card. And based off of my understanding, this is a somewhat normal practice over there. I could be wrong about that, but I did a little bit of searching and kind of came up to like, oh yeah, this is the dumb resellers that we have in Japan. And what'll happen is you have people that have very strong opinions where they're like, I will absolutely never buy with these type of gotcha mechanics, basically. And I think those people are the equivalent of the people in the West that would refuse to buy from a scalper. Because what happens is there are so many people that want these consoles that they're just like, whatever, it's another credit card, whatever, it's another membership, or like, I already have a membership for this store, so I'll buy it. And these tactics work more often than not, because again, people really want a specific product, they're going to go out and buy it. And that's part of the reason why the Switch 2 came off to a pretty good start in Japan, because a lot of these stores were implementing this, but people were still buying it. And the way that fanboys seem to be looking at it is that, well, yeah, if this thing was actually popular, people would have just bought it despite all of these credit card requirements. And then after the credit card stuff went away, it became you need to line up on a Saturday morning. Obviously, the first time they did that, it sells out in minutes, and that was a couple months ago now. But by now, sometimes people line up and it just stays in stock until either the end of the day or the end of the next day. And then these stores bring more out the next week. What's curious to me right now is whether these stores are running out of stock or whether they're withholding stock in order to sell more the following week based off of how much they sold this week. So like, for example, I want to make sure as a business owner that people are coming into my store pretty regularly and they're not all coming in one day and just leaving. It's the same way Nintendo has been withholding stock, same concept. So the first weekend they'll put out 100 Switch 2 units. It'll sell out pretty quickly. The following week they'll put out another 100, and either it doesn't sell out as quickly, or they might actually have a few more left over by the end of a specific day and be like, we're just gonna put it in for next week. So then in that following week, they'll put out 75 or 50. and they'll see that it takes a couple days to do that, and then just keep slowing it down, basically. This is kind of like their scummy way to keep the hype flowing and keep people coming into their store more and more, and hopefully getting more memberships and more people to download their apps and whatnot. Because obviously, if you're going to make it into the store, you also are probably going to buy an accessory, you might buy something else. It's good business as far as they're concerned. Now, it could be that, or it could just be that Nintendo only is sending out a certain amount of units, and this thing is so high in demand that as soon as they get into the stores, they put them out there and they sell out immediately. The reason why I don't think that's the case is because every single week since I started tracking this stuff, people online have been reporting more and more about how much less restrictions there are in order to buy these things. And in this past week, one of the major retailers actually sent out notifications and messages to people that already own their app, just being like, hey, just FYI, you can come and buy this thing if you want. And there are basically no restrictions. They're trying to get people to come into their stores. Now, this is not me saying that the Switch 2 is readily available, but it is easier to grab, significantly easier to grab than it was earlier. And I would say way earlier, because the reports that I'm basing it off, it's been like this since at least Bonanza, which coincides with the time that they were just readily available in stores in the West. My prediction at this point in time is that they're basically stretching out as much as they can, they being the retailers, not Nintendo. The people that are willing to come in and buy this thing from the stores still in the thought that it's completely difficult to get and it's completely a rare item that you have to trip over people to grab. And I don't know if they can necessarily stretch it for much longer. So very soon, I'm predicting, and again, this is just a prediction, that we're going to have a week where the Switch 2 has a very strong week. And I think that's going to be the week where the Switch 2 is just going to be available in Japan at that point. Otherwise, it's going to stay at these numbers until it hits the holidays, and I think that in Japan specifically, the Switch 2 will have a good holiday season. Because whatever the case is, at some point, Japan has to get a major bump when the stock is readily available. Whether that's holiday or not is yet to be seen. This is as opposed to the US where, again, this is just my opinion, I think that the Switch 2 got that readily available bump in July, and that huge availability bump hit in July and is not going to necessarily hit as hard in the holidays anymore, because oftentimes not only do these things sell well in the holidays because it's the holidays, but they also sell very well because a lot of consoles are actually pumped out into the market and they become readily available for effectively the first time. That was the case for the Switch 1, for example, and that's why the units doubled. So if we still continue to see these numbers that hover around this area for the Switch 2 over the course of the next few months, I expect a huge jump in the Christmas season. Otherwise, it might come sooner and this thing might be much more available by the end of September, which is kind of what I'm leaning towards. The only thing is, I don't know how big of a shift it makes when this thing just becomes available nationwide in Japan. Like, we know that in the States, it ended up hitting 480,000 in July. And I think in that first week of August, it was still doing pretty well. So we'll see how August looks. But basically, that would mean that in the West, in the States specifically, that first opening weekend, that was the main launch. It managed 1.1 million units. It managed another 500,000 while stock was still kind of tough to get to, but not impossible. And then when it became readily available, it hit roughly another 500,000. And that was effectively the Switch 2's second launch. And now demand is satiated. It's in stock everywhere. And I'm guessing the next big bump is going to be Christmas time, but we'll see. But on the flip side, now we're talking Japan. It's almost at 2 million units sold. There's a good chance once this thing becomes readily available, that big week for it might be a 200,000 week. And that big week, or even 2 weeks, might end up not selling out. It just might be readily available, and we'll find out exactly where like that demand of launch hype would be satiated. And I realize we are now 3 months removed from launch, but despite that, this is still very much the launch window. There are still people in Japan specifically that are really trying to get the Switch 2, and they're waiting for it to just be available so they can grab it, because either they do not have the store credit card, or they can't make it to the store, or it's too far away from them. There's a plethora of reasons. Whatever the case is, I think this shows that we live to fight another day. I'm not gonna lie, I went into this morning thinking that the Switch 2 was gonna have like just a massive week and it was gonna shut me up for a while. And it's actually more stressful now that I see that it didn't have a massive week, because I'm like, that's another week of tracking random forums and websites and sales numbers and data. And I do enjoy doing that, but that's the problem. I enjoy doing that, so now I won't stop doing it. And it unfortunately takes up a lot of time. Anyway, I think that's all I got for right now. I'll be honest, I've never played Hollow Knight before, and Silksong will be my first game. I'm gonna be trying it out over the course of this weekend, probably later tonight after work. So I'm a little excited for that, but I don't know if that game will necessarily suck me in the way other Metroidvanias have in the past. I guess we'll find out, and if it's something that I feel super strongly about, I might make a video about it. Oh, actually, I do have one more thing to add, and this is a little bit funny. So normally what Famitsu does is on their website, they post the top 10, and then the following day you get the top 30. Well, as you all know, last week was the Switch 2's worst performing week since launch. And coincidentally, Famitsu didn't update that top 30 chart on their website until like just a couple hours before these numbers were released this morning. So over the course of the past week, if somebody in Japan was like, I want to go to Famitsu.com and see which game sold the best last week, through the entire week almost, it showed that Mario Kart World was the best-selling game at 60,000 games sold, where in actuality it should have said 30,000 because normally they have that page updated. But now it looks a little fishy because if somebody was to go to the website now and see this new top 10 list, they'd be like, oh, Metal Gear Solid also sold 60,000. It sold as much as Mario Kart did last week, where in actuality it sold double what Mario Kart World managed last week. Now, in fairness to Famitsu, they could have just been falling behind, but they've made a lot of blunders since the Switch 2 launched, and every single one of those blunders have made Nintendo look better, at least in the eyes of the Japanese people. So it does make somebody start to question things a little bit. Yeah, that's all I got. I'll see you guys next time.